Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here now. All right, folks, we'll go ahead and get started the government reform panel. If we could wind up our conversations, we'll get this tax panel going. I'm Jason Mercier, Director of the Center for Government Reform with the Washington Policy Center. I'd like to thank you for joining us this afternoon on this panel to give a preview of the upcoming 2015 legislative session. This should be a very historic session, something that hopefully will get done by the end of April, not in June or July, but we'll hear more perspective from our speakers here in just a few minutes. But before we turn it over to our panel that consists of the Chair of the House Finance Committee, Representative Reuven Carlyle, and the Chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, Senator Andy Hill, to give their perspectives on what to expect this session on the budget, tax policy, and overall government reform, I'd like to first turn it over to former State Auditor Brian Sonntag and new WPC board member to give a few brief comments on the importance of government transparency and accountability. So please join me in welcoming State Auditor Brian Sonntag.
Well, Jason, thank you very much. And I am so glad to see so many people in a room who want to hear about government reform. I've got my seat staked out right there because I'm one of them. I'd like to know, and this was introduced a little earlier as the panel that will tell you how they're going to balance the state budget without increasing taxes. And I didn't make that up. That's what I heard earlier from someone. But I'd like to thank the Policy Center, certainly, for putting on an event like this. Certainly Senator Hill and Representative Carlyle for their leadership in Olympia and taking on some very tough decisions. They both should be commended because I know how hard they work at this. And whether we're talking about budgets, sustainable budgets, difficult policy decisions, the important, even essential elements really are accountability, openness, and transparency. I've always believed that accountability is best defined as government being open and accessible, responsive, responsible, a government that listens to people and when it talks to them tells them the truth. And that's a pretty simple definition, but it worked well for us. When we talk about transparency and openness, we're talking about the public's right to know, the public's right to see what government does, how it does it, have access to records. It's not about a government employee's right to determine what you have the right to see or to know. And you know, we have now a really new and unique opportunity in holding state government accountable, but even more so in citizen participation in their government, where now, for the first time, the state is going to have remote testimony, where people from various places around the state will have the opportunity to testify before a legislative committee, make their voice heard without having to figure out a way to get to and park and find the hearing room in Olympia and the hearing may have been canceled by the time you get there anyway. So again, it's because of leadership like the two guys right here that these things are happening. I'm going to go take my seat and learn how they're going to do this. Thank you very much.
So as Brian mentioned, the goal of this historic session, along with budget sustainability and addressing issues on our tax structure, is to make sure it's done in an accountable way, a transparent way that actually produces good outcomes for Washingtonians for those investments. And I'm hoping that our speakers this afternoon will be able to give us their perspectives on how to get that accomplished. I know that to set the stage a little bit on this, we are seeing economic growth, an estimated $3 billion, about 9% over the biennia of new revenue to spend. We have, on the other side of the equation, the legislature held in contempt over education spending, potentially adding anywhere between $2 billion to $7 billion of new obligations, depending upon who you ask. And we also have the historical reaction from voters on what they think should happen on tax policy. So the challenge for these two gentlemen over the next 3 months is to try to figure out how to put all of those together and get out on time. I'm pretty sure that we're not going to get to that point, but hopefully before the state treasurer gets nervous on July 1st, you'll have a budget agreement. But the first perspective we'll have offered to us, do we have the clicker? Not quite yet. Well, see, here's the challenge when you have a panel put together by a guy with a flip phone, is we don't have a lot of technology for you. All right, so we're going to go ahead and bring up Senator Andy Hill first, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, to give the outlook from the Senate on how to address the session on budget and tax policy. You're welcome to come up front here. Or?
Yeah, actually, I'll come up front.
I should say, please join me in welcoming Senator Andy Hill.
So I don't have a clicker? All right. Well, great. Thanks so much for that nice introduction, and thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate what the Washington Policy Center does, and to be able to bring a group like this together is phenomenal. So we ready to roll? You can run mine. Mine's in PowerPoint in a Microsoft product. Created on my Microsoft Surface over there. Did I mention my district has the most Microsoft employees in the state? All right, go ahead to the next slide, please. So, you know, what I'm going to talk about is there's a lot of talk about what the session looks like and what we're dealing with. And quite frankly, unfortunately, I want to set the record straight and deal with some facts, because what we've been hearing for really the last 6 months is that there's some kind of an Armageddon coming with respect to the state budget. And as I say, the sky is falling, the end is near. All right? And this started in the summer when the governor asked all state agencies to come up with 15% reductions in their budgets. So it scared the daylights out of everybody. We had one college university that refused to do that. During the fall, the budget director went on tour in the state, talked about this huge multi-billion-dollar deficit and how terrible it is, and then finally, just recently, the governor released his budget, where he proposed the largest tax increase in state history. It was effectively $2 billion a year when it's fully running. So $4 billion a biennia when it's fully engaged. So next slide, please. So let's talk about facts, right? Fact number one is we've got $37.2 billion in projected revenue coming into the state. Resources available to spend. We can afford, with that money, to pay for all ongoing government services. Including in that, we can pay for increased caseloads. More people qualify for guaranteed government benefits. That goes up and down. They generally go up. We can cover inflation in these programs. We can also fund required items that have popped up since we left the legislature in March. So wildfires, $100 million more than we expected. Some court rulings that force us to rightfully so make bigger investments in mental health, and a new hepatitis C drug, which is very expensive but very effective. But with the resources we have coming into the state, we can cover all of that. And this is what you would call, they call the maintenance level. I call it ongoing costs. Go ahead. So we've got $37.2 billion coming in. That ongoing cost for that maintenance level budget costs $36.2. That gives us an extra $1 billion. And I will point out that that's an 8.6% increase in revenues over the last biennium. So, 4.3% growth in income, in revenues. And for business owners out there, I think you'd be pretty happy with that on a year-over-year basis. It is a lot of money, $3 billion. Next slide, please. So we've got an extra $1 billion to spend. $1 billion. And that $1 billion actually showed up since we left last March. So we see the economy slowly improving. I count cranes. So anybody that's been in downtown Seattle, a lot of cranes. There's cranes in Woodinville and Kirkland right now in my district. Not so statewide. I mean, really, it's Puget Sound is the driver. It's going through a bit of a boom right now, but it's not even across the state. But with that $1 billion, we can also cover other statutory items that we're required to do by current state law. One is to give teachers a COLA. This is Initiative 732. It's essentially a 3% across the board pay raise. It's been suspended for the last, I believe, 6 years. We have enough to pay for that. We also have enough to pay for the next required McCleary investment, which is about $760 million worth of materials and supplies. And so with that, basically, it drives it. Right now, we're spending about $850 per student on materials and supplies. This gets you up to $1,200 per student. That is what's in the law, in the McCleary law, that says we have to do this biennium. So we can handle all of our ongoing costs. We can put $1 billion of additional new enhancements into K-12 education. Go ahead. Third fact, all the other policy enhancements you hear about, and this is how the governor gets to say we've got a $2.5 billion deficit. All of that is optional, with the exception of Initiative 1351. And 1351, as a side note, the governor didn't even fund it in his budget. It is a $4 to $6 billion fully burdened program, and no legislator I've talked to has figured out how they could pay for it. Again, that's $4 billion on top of a $37 billion budget, to put that in perspective. And quite frankly, I don't know how I can raise taxes enough to pay for that, so you'd have to raise taxes and also have to do some pretty draconian cuts. You'd have to cut everything but K-12 education. So let's take 1351. If you take that out of the picture, everything else is optional, right? It has to be agreed on by the legislature. These are policy enhancements. Top of the list, governor negotiated new collective bargaining agreements, about $500 million of raises to state employees. We have additional McCleary investments that are due, but not this biennium. They're due in the next biennium, depending on who you ask. It's between, half a billion to $1 billion. And on the McCleary, I think everybody knows the McCleary. It's a Supreme Court decision that said the Constitution says the state's paramount duty is to provide an ample education for every student in the state. The state said, the Supreme Court said, you're not doing that. They're right. We also have to look at outcomes. But it's really interesting. I just got out of an election season, and during the election, the amount of money we needed to put in McCleary varied between $750 million and $10 billion, depending on who you're asking, who you're talking to. Now the election's over, everyone kind of has agreed it's between $1 and $2 billion. Governor put $1.3 billion in, and he finished it all. He finished it a year early. So other investments we may very well want to look at and probably need to do. Mental health, right? Cuts a swath across all of government. It deals with it hits homelessness, it hits our safety net, it hits domestic violence, it hits gun violence. Something we have not been doing a great job on. We need to make more investments there. The governor put $50 million into additional mental health investments. We made a lot last year of additional mental health investments. Higher education, right? These are investments. Right now we have a huge shortage of qualified workers coming out of our schools, mostly in the STEM degrees. We can make more investments in that, right? Tuition has doubled over the last 10 years. Doubled over the last 10 years. In the last 2 budgets, we managed to freeze tuition the first time in 32 years, to do it 2 years in a row. And I'll tell you, that was a battle. Because raising tuition is effectively a cost shift onto the lower and the middle income people. It's a hidden tax. It's very easy to take what the state used to spend it somewhere else, raise tuition, make it up on the backs of students and their parents. Economic drivers. There's tax policy. I'm sure that Representative Carlyle will talk about this. There's tax policy that clearly helps drive additional revenue. The way we bank it, the way we account for it, it costs the state money from the budget, even though it may generate more money in the long run. So there may be investments we want to make to spur economic development, and that is create jobs. Go ahead, next one. So I'll wrap it up And then we can get to questions. I guess you'll talk and then we'll take questions. We got $3 billion of additional money. We got a sizable surplus. We can fund what we've been doing and account for all the growth and all the gotchas that have popped up in the last year. If we want to do additional policy adds, if we want to make additional investments, that's part of the legislative process. That's what we do every 2 years in Olympia. And everything needs to be weighed and argued and figured out what's the right priority, because let's face it, we have scarce resources. Right? Even if you raise taxes substantially, it's still scarce resources. And as I like to say, given the situation we have, we do not have a brutal deficit. We may want to make more investments, but there's this false choice that a lot of people propagate, that is, you either have to raise taxes or make these mean-spirited cuts. There is a third way. It's called innovative budgeting. It's called savings. It's called running your government intelligently. I believe someone said they were going to fix all the problems with lean management. Right? And I will tell you, the attempts at imposing lean management have been rebuked severely by the governor. In fact, he just released a report on lean management efforts. 600 lean management projects. They cited 18 that had savings, and a savings of $5.6 million. Now, they averted $27 million of costs, so 30 million or so of savings. Interestingly enough, none of that got put back into the state treasury. So, there are ways where you can spend your money more wisely. The fact that we spent $100 on a program last year does not mean we need to spend $100 on it, or $110, the expected growth, this year. We can do things more innovatively. We can look at cutting wastes. But you've got to have the will from the executive to do that. But again, it is a false choice to say you raise taxes or make cuts. There's a third way to do it. We've done it in the past. I think we can do it again. And as I like to say, taxes, new taxes, should be our last resort. They shouldn't be the first response. Right? I never took the Grover Norquist pledge never to raise a tax. But if I'm taking more money out of your pocket, I better be really, really sure I've done everything in my power to spend the money I've already taken from you wisely, efficiently, looking for outcomes, looking for the correct return on investment before I take any more. And I would argue, if you look at the governor's budget, first thing out of the gate, new taxes. Right? Governor's budget director went across the state in the fall. First thing, we need more taxes. They use the term revenue and resources. But again, that is a myth. Right? If we want to make additional investments, that's fine. But we better make sure we've done everything we can with what we have first. I think that's what the voters expect. Certainly what I focus on when I'm in Olympia. I think it's pretty clear that the voters are pretty cranky about taxes. If you look over the last 5 years, every tax that's been on the ballot has failed, even in King County. So what I hear over and over again is we're sending you a lot of money, you're not spending it real wisely. And whether that's true or not, every week King 5 does an expose. Right? So reality is perception. Our perception becomes reality. We've got to do a better job. We need to convince the voters that we're going to be good stewards, responsible stewards of their money. And right now, voters don't think we've been doing that. So I think we have a lot of work to do. It will be a challenge. There are additional investments we want to make, but I think that on a fact base, the sky is not falling. The world is not coming to an end. I'll be releasing a white paper later today that lays this PowerPoint out with all the details and footnoted, and again, very fact-based. So with that, thanks so much. Looking forward to having a interesting discussion.
So the budget math in Olympia is 25, 50, and 1. You need 25 senators, you need 50 representatives, and you need a governor to sign it. This is the math that we need to keep in mind as we hear different perspectives on how to approach this session, because at the end of the day, these two gentlemen are going to have to find those 25 votes, those 50 votes, and that one governor to sign it to get us to go home with a sustainable budget. I'm very happy to have Representative Carlyle here to give his perspective on the session, and to also thank him for his tireless efforts on transparency for the government. Enjoyed working with you on trying to improve that for tax preferences and spending. I can tell you this presentation that you were going to see is really cool. We're going to try to make it work. Blame the flip phone guy for where we are on this. Please join me in welcoming Representative Carlyle.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Reuven Carlyle. I live in Seattle with my wife, who's an anesthesiologist at Swedish, and our 4 children, ages 17, 15, 13, and 8. I will tell you that coming from the private sector, I've worked in about 7 or 8 startup companies since I was at McCaw Cellular Communications, and until you have laid in bed and looked at the ceiling at 3:27 a.m. in the morning and worried about payroll, you don't know the core DNA of the anxiety of the reality of paying the bills. And I think Senator Hill is absolutely right. A deep, visceral sense of appreciation of the public's hard-earned tax dollars is core to our work. But at the same time, in coming from the private sector, I encourage us to acknowledge that there are systems issues, that there are structural issues that go to the core of our ability to make meaningful progress. So what does that mean? So we talk about revenue growth, but we have an upside down and backwards tax structure that means that high volatility during times of economic activity put money into the coffers with dramatic reductions during difficult times. The challenge with that is that 3/4 of our entire budget, healthcare, education, incarceration, major categories, don't have that type of elasticity. So it is true that we have to be responsible, and it is true that we have to be incredibly sensitive. But we have to look at economic growth and cost drivers, not just around the edges, but at their core. So I'm going to suggest that it's really healthy to have an authentic conversation about our tax burden, about what works and what doesn't work. And I would suggest to you that our tax structure is the core systems issue. It's structural, and it's incredibly important to put on the table a recognition that the sales tax has pros and cons, but lots of cons. The property tax in our state has its own dynamics, and the business and occupation tax, the 3 major pillars, all have structural problems that go to the core of our inability to have responsible growth without dramatic volatility that really stops us from pretending like there's extraordinary amounts of money that come in one day and disappear the next day. So with that, I don't know if the presentation is working. If it's not, I'll just keep going. So if you can bring that up. So the mission statement for me in terms of tax policy and on the budget is to raise the level of analytical and financial and intellectual and policy rigor to not just our spending, but to our taxes. So what does that mean? I believe the best tax structure that would tackle many of the systems issues we face today would be low rates, broadly applied, with few exemptions, and thus depoliticized. And what we have is categorically the opposite. We have high rates, narrowly applied, hundreds of exemptions, and highly political. And I'm going to make the argument that the loser isn't just the low income, it's small business. The loser is those who don't have access to unfair, fair treatment. So let's talk about that. So our base budget, we have some additional revenue this year. Where did it come from? Yes, it came from cranes. It's absolutely true. And there's great economic growth, and people make lots of fun of those legislative districts that are within the sight of the Space Needle. Well, I happen to represent the Space Needle in that district, so I get the Seattle-centric criticism. But I will tell you that in our base budget, the economic growth that we have seen, 2 years ago in the budget, we did 5 things that have set the stage for us to be here today. We raised hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes. We reinstituted the estate tax. We passed a telecommunications reform bill. Those 2 tax increases together accounted for hundreds of millions of dollars this biennium. We raised taxes to do it. We swept the Public Works Trust Fund, which allows local communities to build sewage systems and infrastructure. We swept the capital budget, which builds schools and prisons and other facilities. We added an assessment to hospital beds. So those 5 things account for a good chunk of the economic revenue growth that we're seeing today. The problem is that many of them are one-time. I come from the private sector. Senator Hill comes from the private sector, with different experiences, obviously. But I will tell you that we have to have the courageous honesty to put those systems issues on the table and to acknowledge those core issues are getting in the way of our ability to talk about spending in a way that isn't just about pretending that we have an out-of-control spending system. We have structural issues on the spending side that are legitimate, and we have structural issues on the revenue side. In 1995, I'm not sure if this is working or not, if you want to try. In 1995, the state of Washington, you want to give that a click and see if that's working? There you go. Okay, go ahead on the right side. There you go. All right. Okay, so let me give you a quick overview. We'll go down. Go ahead. Thank you. So there are 5 generally accepted principles of a tax structure. Go ahead. Next, please. Adequacy. And the core definition of whether our tax system is working and our budget is right is, are we meeting the needs of our citizens? It's wrong to double tuition in 10 years, but it's wrong to be under court order for underfunding public education. It's wrong to be under court order for not funding mental health. Go ahead and click the next, please. Adequacy is a core issue. Economic vitality, fairness, stability, and transparency all go to the core of a responsible, modern 21st century tax structure. Core systems issues, please. I'm going to make the case that we fail in every single category, and I'll rattle through these quickly. Go ahead. We are becoming a low-tax state. I know it's shocking, but I'm going to make that case. In 1995, we were 11th in the nation when you combined all state and local taxes, liquor taxes, transportation taxes, property, sales, business and occupation tax, every excise tax. 11th in the nation, unquestionably a high-tax state. Today, 19 years later, we are 35th in the nation in the aggregate level of all state and local taxes based on personal income, which is the metric that the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the left and the right-wing think tanks, and all the organizations apply. From 11th to 35th in 19 years. What happened? Next, please. Next, please. So the national average is $108. What does that mean? On $1,000 of income, $108, all of your taxes combined. Washington State at 98. Next, please. If you look at those states that we aspire to be relative to high-tech economy, strong agriculture sector, strong trade, and other types of educated workforce and public infrastructure, states like Minnesota, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Colorado, North Carolina, we are lower than every single one of those states, with the exception of Virginia, which has hundreds of billions of dollars of federal defense spending, so they're an outlier. Next, please. Flip it over. We have a lower tax burden than 6 of the 10 of the poor states in this country. Next, please. From 11th to 35th in 19 years. Effective tax rate, the reality facing most of us. Next, please. Next, please. So I'm going to argue that our reliance on a high sales tax, our reliance on a gross receipts tax, which is incredibly economically inefficient, unfair, And our reliance on the state property tax is an outlier in the nation and not in a handsome way. Next, please. Click. So the number one reason, there's three core reasons. What are they? Number one, the business and occupation tax. We collect $3.1 billion a year in B&O taxes in the state of Washington. The entire aerospace sector combined pays $71.8 million of that $3.1 billion. The entire technology industry sector, every single technology company that you can name, and those that you can't, pays $28.2 million of that $3.1 billion. The entire agriculture sector, one of the biggest sectors in our state, the entire timber industry, one of the largest sectors in this state, combined $14 million a year in B&O taxes. I am not saying for a moment that those hundreds of thousands of employees that they have don't buy refrigerators and cars and homes, and that consumption's critical, and we value that, and we honor that, and we want them here. But we need to acknowledge that the effective tax rate and the effect of 655 tax breaks is inequitable. Next, please. Reason number two, the voters, as is their right as the supreme law of the land of our state, the voters have carved out, through limitations on property tax, the property tax growth, and it is a smaller and smaller percentage of the state tax base. Next, please. And here's the chart that shows that. Effectively carved out. That was the original intent. The state property tax was to fund education in 1889. Next, please. And the next is the sales tax. Only 33% of what you buy today is covered by the sales tax. In 1950, it was 70%. It was the exact opposite. And it's not just shopping online. We have narrowed the base. And it has the effect of making the sales tax not broad-based and not fair, but inequitable and narrow. Next, please. So our reliance is about volatility. Just click through the next three very quickly. And this just shows that the B&O tax is highly volatile, the sales tax is highly volatile, and income-based is less volatile. But we don't have that component. It's an element of a broader picture. Next, please. Next, please. So we have to acknowledge that the economic inefficiency, putting aside the issue of equity, the economic inefficiency of a system that burdens business with high B&O tax, gross receipts, and a sales tax that sometimes is very difficult to pass through is incredibly inefficient. Next. And business pays a disproportionate amount, many of them on business inputs. Of those 655 tax breaks, many of them, the lobbyists line up naturally and understandably because they want to be carved out from the negative economic externalities, the negative effects of a gross receipts and the negative effects of a high sales tax. And you can't blame them. We all want to be carved out. But what we're doing is we're hiding the negative effects of this upside-down structure. Next, please. Next. And it's unfair. It's unfair to those without lobbyists. It's unfair to those without campaign cash. It's unfair to those who do not have the ability to get carved out. And that is not just about the low income. 74% of the businesses in the state of Washington make $250,000 a year or less. 74% of every business, of the 350,000 businesses in this state, make $250,000 a year or less after credits, and yet they are burdened, in effect, with a full amount. Next, please. And this is the question of equity. The wealthiest in our state have an effective tax rate of 2.8%, and the poorest of the poor have an effective tax rate of 17%. Next, please. So who does benefit? Next. I'm going to argue that the lack of transparency makes it difficult to understand how this unfair system burdens business and burdens the middle class. Next. So just to give you a sense, in the 1990s, the legislature, under primarily Democratic control, but also Republican control in part, created 103 tax breaks. And the fiscal cost of that today is $1.5 billion. It's totally and completely off the books. It's off budget. It's the political mist, the wind. And the fact is that we don't have the courage to talk openly about that structural problem. When you vote for it once, it's gone forever. The foregone revenues of that are a legitimate public policy question. Next. And these are some of the tax exemptions and preferences that are coming up. Senator Hill said some of those create economic activity. That's no doubt about it. But I've worked hard to try to bring some intellectual and some analytical and some financial rigor to determining whether or not they're actually working. Of the 655 tax exemptions and preferences that we have in this state, about 150 are designed to generate jobs and economic activity. But only 32 of those are public in terms of who benefits for how much. So how can we know? The lack of intellectual and analytical rigor is stunning. And it's unethical, because we need the same level of rigor to the tax side of the ledger that we expect of the spending side. It's a public choice. It's unfair to the middle class. It's unfair to small business. I would note that in thinking about our tax burden, we are 35th in the nation. The effective tax rate is the core issue. For some of our wealthiest global corporation citizens, some of our individuals, I truly believe that low rates, broadly applied with few exemptions, is the right thing to do for our state. I would encourage us to recognize that even though we've had economic growth coming out of this Great Recession, that 50% of that money was already spent on one-time gimmicks that both sides and both of us voted for, both of us helped design, and we have to have the courageous honesty to acknowledge that. Is $34 billion the right number of the base budget of the state of Washington? That's up to the people. That's up to their elected representatives in representative democracy. But the fact of the matter is we have double tuition. The fact is we have a mental health counseling problem. We have K-12 system. We have to appreciate the reality of taxes as the price of a civilized society. We can be smarter and better as a state than what we've become. And I really believe that we can get there with an era of divided government, a sense of bipartisanship, a sense of cooperation. So many of these systems issues goes to the core of people's conviction to do the best that we can together, and I think there's a lot more in common than that separates us. Thank you.
So at the Policy Center, we're always working for efficient use of time and to show you got your money's worth. You just got the next 6 months of legislative debate in 30 minutes. So now you know exactly what's going to happen. Before we turn it over to your questions, I would like to take one question for myself here, and if I could have you two share the mic to the audience questions. Ideally, as budget writers, you have as much control over the budget as possible. You get to make those prioritizations and decisions. We know the McCleary ruling has taken some of that away from you. Some of the recent rulings on mental health have done that. One thing that I'd like to ask you about is on the collective bargaining agreements that the governor negotiated. About $500 million is included. Whether or not you think that amount should be funded, is this the right process? Or should the legislature, as was the case prior to 2002, have control over that decision making?
Well, yeah, and the way we do collective bargaining in this state, and this is only about 10 years old, I mean, this is not a birthright, is that the governor negotiates collective bargaining agreements with the state employees in private, behind closed doors, right? They blow white smoke out of the chimney, emerge, and the legislature then can do a simple yes or no. They cannot amend that collective bargaining agreement at all. So is it a straight up or down? So to Jason's question, if you want to talk about transparency, I mean, it is completely broken. And you know, I don't have a problem with unions. I have a problem when you have a system that has outsized power to one side. And right now, it is outsized. And in this state, You know, and it's this perverse circle where you funnel campaign contributions to a governor who you negotiate with for your pay increase. And then you take mandatory paycheck deductions from your members, which, by the way, are more than needed just to represent you. So you've got a lot of extra money, so you can funnel it back into the political system. So, you know, if you're talking, you know, transparency, fair, I think the system is really broken.
So I would make the case that I am probably an outlier in my party on this question, but I also think that transparency is of greater value than the logistical and tactical value that comes from having the confidentiality of actual negotiations, which is hard to do. If we had to open up our negotiations every single minute of every day, it would not be easy. So I acknowledge that there was compelling reasons why people felt this was good policy, but I do not think it's responsible to not have a level of transparency into this. I would argue that philosophical consistency is hard, and for us to be philosophically consistent on this one, we have to be open to conversations about philosophical consistency of who benefits from a tax break, for how much, or how much taxes are paid, which is aggregated at the federal level. It's allowed to be published, but not at the state level, things like that. So philosophical consistency cuts both ways for all of us. We have to work on that.
Great. Well, with that, we can turn it over to your questions. Yes, sir. I think we have a mic coming.
Thanks. Matt McElwain. I'm on the board of the Washington Policy Center. Andy, Reuven, it's great to have you here. And Reuven in particular, I really appreciate you taking the time to come and to share your thoughts. In fact, I'd love to see your presentation and understand it a little bit better. I am struggling, though, with a system that you characterize as unfair that's generated $3 billion more in tax revenues over the last biennium and is projected to increase by another $3 billion in the next biennium. And I think we need to kind of be careful about the forest from the trees, because if I decode what I think you're saying there, you're also suggesting that we need to create yet another taxing vehicle. I believe it's an income on capital gains in order to somehow make the system fair. And I think the voters of Washington State have done a pretty clear and consistent job of rejecting the creation of an income tax. So did I decode it correctly that you're in favor of an income tax on capital gains? And why is that necessary in light of the facts about tax revenue increases over this 4-year period of time?
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate that. So the structural question of how much increase in growth we've had is driven in large part by a consumption-based system. So with all the construction, the economic activity. So we are seeing a growth coming out of the greatest recession since World War II. So it's all about that baseline context. Is $34 billion base revenue the right level of spending? So it's not just about what the growth is year to year. I feel like when I say the word unfair, it's not a euphemism in and of itself. The core issue is that our system couldn't be more unfairly designed. If you have not been carved out, if you have not had a shift of revenues, whether you're a business or whether you're ultimately an individual, you have an unfair advantage. It is the categorical opposite of low rates broadly applied with few exemptions. We have high rates very narrowly applied with hundreds of exemptions. And my point is that if you believe that business is disproportionately burdened by paying for sales tax on their inputs, which is billions of dollars, extraordinarily economically inefficient on every level, and many of the tax breaks that we write are designed to reduce that. Then you believe we have to broaden the base. When the upper income of our state has an effective tax rate of 2.8%, I do believe we are failing to capture an element of fairness there, and that we should recognize that that is not punitive to ask folks to contribute that part of the tax base. It is something we are not taxing today in any way. We cannot continue to ratchet up an economically inefficient sales tax, an economically inefficient business tax, an economically unfair, the way it's designed in a sense, property tax, have zero progressivity in any way, and expect to have any kind of long-term stability. So I think that it's a responsible, I think it's a modest, I would support a low, flat rate capital gains as an element of a broader tax reform. I think it's about fairness.
Senator Hill, did you want to comment on the capital gains at all?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of talk about capital gains, but I mean, the one that's been proposed by the governor is not broadly applied. It's applied, he claims, to the top 1%. It is not reliable. In fact, it's one of the most volatile sources of income you can find. And one of the things that the Cleary decisions was very clear is that you need to have a reliable, sustainable revenue stream to fund education. So from a capital gains perspective, I don't think it really addresses that. And I'll also, you know, and again, this is not what Representative Carlyle talked about, but you know, the governor proposed, you know, literally $4 billion a biennium of new taxes, and that's additional to what we already have. I mean, if you want to talk about massive tax reform and fixing the system, and I agree with Reuven on a number of the issues. I mean, the B&O tax. I mean, there's lots there for everybody on either side to hate our tax system. I think the bigger issue is to do major tax reform, you have to do everything at once. And in my, you know, again, I've only been doing this a few years, but I see three things required to do that. I mean, first of all, you need split government, because you get the most reforms when you have split government, because then everybody gets a seat at the table. We have that. Check that box off. You need to be in a time of severe economic growth, because whenever you do major tax reform, you create winners and losers. There's no way around it. And you need extra money to bring those, to transition those people. We're not there. We have economic growth. It's uneven across the state. It is not the level you need to do that. And third, quite frankly, you need to be away from an election year. And ideally, in the first year of a lame duck governor's term. You know, Dan Evans tried this. So, and we don't have that either. So I don't think the stars have aligned, but I mean, our tax system is, you know, there's lots to hate about it. I deal in political realities, and so I work with what we've got. I'm always having these conversations about the what ifs, because there's plenty of stuff that we don't like on all sides. But right now, you know, and the thing is, we are doing things, we are band-aiding and scaffolding our existing system. So to cut down on this boom bust, we created the rainy day fund. So when we have high, you know, we sock away money, so next time we have a recession, we're sitting on $1 billion right now. We also created a constitutional amendment that says in times of extraordinary revenue, we also sock away a bunch of that into the rainy day fund. So we don't commit to spending that we can't pay for when the business cycle inevitably drops. So, I mean, we're doing things. We have a 4-year balanced budget requirement now, again, to prevent us from making a lot of one-time things that create unfunded liabilities in the future. But these are fixes to the existing system. Problem is, fixing that existing system, in my mind, requires a number of things. We're not at that point to do it.
So we had a question toward the back.
Hi, I wanted to ask our two political leaders about a particular way to increase government efficiency, which I assume they built before, but I wanted to know. And a lot of other states don't make the public education entitlement all or nothing. So other states, if you're in the public schools, and the state will allow you to take a portion of it, maybe half of it, if you want to homeschool or if you want to go to a private school and you're leaving the public school system, half of what the state was spending on you before, they'll now let you take with you in the form of a scholarship. It tends to save money and it increases choice. It's particularly helpful to parents of special needs kids and foster kids, and since it saves money, I would assume you'd both be favorable to it, but I just wanted to check.
He gave you the presumptive close, so I'll let you answer first.
The paramount duty clause of the state is, actually, I think there's an interesting philosophical argument about it. it's intuitive to think that it means more funding and better outcomes at the state level to have a state-centric system. But in fact, I would make the case that there's something interesting in that most states that have higher quality outcomes also have more funding, but they're locally funded, and that there is a philosophical conversation there. The question of what the flexibility ought to be, I think, is opened the door by the recent initiative by the people, and I think that that experiment ought to continue at this stage to see where it leads. And once we learn from that, I think it's an open conversation to talk about other ways to do that. But I feel strongly that the core value of public education is the DNA and the soul of this state and of this country, and that we have to ensure that public education is a fundamental right for everyone. And it's a moral issue, it's an economic, and it's about an educated and civic society. So I'm cautious about how we distribute those dollars.
I just want to have students that are educated, and all students are educated to participate in the 21st century. How we do that, I'm pretty open, right? I'm a big fan of public-private partnerships. The charter school initiative is a step in the right direction. It's not a silver bullet, but I like choices. Different families, different children have different needs. I think to think that a one-size-fits-all system is going to do it is questionable. If a public education system can prove those outcomes, I'm happy. I would argue when we fail 1 in 4 students, they don't graduate from high school, we should be looking at doing things differently.
So we have time for one more question up front over here.
I own several businesses in the state of Washington in the last 35 years, and one of the businesses I have now is 35 years old. It's a parts and service company, and what I don't quite understand is, like, in a lot of times we'll have customers come in and they'll be able to buy parts online cheaper than I can actually buy them for. So we have retail, you have retail sales being done over the internet, but they're actually purchasing at wholesale and or distributor prices. They can actually buy it cheaper than I can. I would like to understand why it is that the state of Washington does not tax everything that comes over the internet, and even possibly add a value-added tax on top of that. And in the event that something like that was to happen, because that would actually level the field. I've invested in the state of Washington, and I have even employees that I've had with me over 20 years. They haven't gotten a raise in 4 or 5 years because of actually what's going on the backside here. I'm not quite sure why some companies have to pay tax selling stuff over the internet and why others don't. But if everything that came in over the internet was charged tax, even if they were selling parts that are the same price that I do, they're saving 10% because they don't have to pay sales tax right out of the gate. What if that was to change? How would that help damper the tax situation?
Absolutely, really appreciate that, Kim. The lack of fairness of the sales tax is driven both by the narrowing base and also by the online. I serve on the national board on behalf of our state that does the Marketplace Fairness Act, which would streamline and have a sense of fairness so that everybody pays. The answer to your question technically is why do some pay and some don't? If a company has a presence in Washington state, they have to pay the sales tax. If they don't technically have a presence in the state, then they don't have to pay, you don't have to pay sales tax. It's categorically unfair. That legislation has been unsuccessful in Congress. We've attempted, we as a state have more fairness than almost any other state because we have a presence of most of the e-commerce providers, but there's a great deal of unfairness because of that, and that is one of the structural issues that I outlined when I said the sales tax is not fair because it's effectively carved out. That's an important example of why.
Well, and yeah, I mean, to add to that, first of all, they should be paying use tax. Legally, they should be paying that tax. If someone buys a flat screen at Best Buy in Bellevue, they pay 9.5%. If they buy it from New York State and it gets shipped in, they should actually be paying use tax. So legally, we should be getting that money. And to give you an idea of the magnitude, it's $500 million or more per biennium that the state loses to the state. Locals are losing $200 million. I mean, that's a significant amount of money. It's got to be solved, unfortunately, at the federal level. You know, I'm not sure what everybody has in terms of confidence that things will get out of the other Washington, but it's a real problem. And you know, people say this is an additional tax. No, technically they should be paying that tax. We are not collecting it.
Well, as you can tell, it's going to be a very interesting session, hopefully no longer than 3 months, and we can get these gentlemen back to their family. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Please join me in thanking Brian Sonntag, Carlyle, and Senator Bill.